Hello and welcome to Geekerati. I'm here this week with Stephen Schend, who is a longtime game designer in superhero role playing games, having worked on the Marvel Superheroes role playing game with TSR back in the day and has worked on a number of games since then. He's here to chat with me about superhero games in general and his thoughts on why the genre is where it is in the role playing game milieu as far as its popularity.
Hello and welcome to Geekerati.
For geeks, by geeks, and with geeks.
Life to level the earth. Welcome to Overtime.
Brave enough to do battle with hideous monsters.
I am Sinistar.
Stephen, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
I want to get your thoughts on the genre in general and your thoughts as far as what some of your favorite superhero role playing games are to start with.
Oh, well, I know the first one I ever encountered was Villains and Vigilantes. That was the first one, and I think a friend of mine convinced me to actually buy it rather than pick up the Dungeon Master's Guide since I'd finally saved up the money for it.
Sure.
This tells you how long ago that was. But we gave that a try, and I loved it for what it was. But yeah, you learn to avoid some things like you almost needed a slide rule to figure out how weather control worked. But there have always been some great supers games from the early times. But yeah, V&V and Champions, Marvel, all those, and yeah, I've got a library downstairs of far more games than I've ever had the time or the inclination to play. Yeah, not inclination. It's just there's never enough players around. It's always been there. I think maybe the only reason it didn't start out sooner was Gary and Dave Arneson were wargamers and not superhero fans as much.
Right.
So.
It's interesting to see that while the first superhero role playing game was Superhero 44, or eventually Superhero 2044, that had a pretty limited reach with regard to who was purchasing it and playing it. And there are reasons for that I can talk about at a later time or do a. In fact, I'll put up a review later this week specifically on Superhero 44. But with Villains and Vigilantes, you had a game that was playable. As you say, if you want to use weather control, maybe a little less playable. And sometimes, if you got the order of operations wrong, you would vastly either under or over adjust your strength score in the game, or at least your carrying capacity, right? Because it had a pretty mathematically intensive way of doing that. But what's really remarkable is that the designers on that, Jeff Dean and Jack Herman, they're like 18 or 16 when they designed that game.
Oh man, that's astounding. For some reason, I thought that they had come up with it, when they were adults, and Jeff was working with TS. I can never remember if he was just a freelancer or if he actually was on staff at TSR. I can't recall. But
Yeah, I mean, he did a lot of the early work in the basic and expert set, and of course in a lot of the modules and stuff. His line art's very distinctive, and I think really was a part of the reason why Villains and Vigilantes did so well. But as you kind of alluded to, mechanically, there were some challenges, or the superhero genre presents certain challenges that lead a game designer to have to adapt them, and the choices that a designer has to make in that can create certain challenges. So I think this is a good place to jump in, and you can of course talk about your experience with Marvel superheroes here in abundance. What is like one of the biggest challenges of adapting the comic book milieu to a role-playing game?
um, balance is one of the toughest things. It's because you need big effects and you need the spectacle. Otherwise, it's not superheroes. It's not comic books. Even if you're just playing at the level of, say, World War II mystery men. Hey, I've got a three-piece suit, a domino mask, and some money. I'll go fight crime.
Right.
You still need some of the mechanics and all that will make it have a bit more, zing, for lack of a better word. I'd say that's always been the hallmark of what made me stick with certain games was not always even ease of use. It was more what feels like the genre or the comic book or the whatever our campaign is supposed to be. What feels right, and it's not always easy to keep the balance in mechanically. I mean, in some ways, I'm so grateful that I fell in when I did with TSR and Marvel, because the system didn't need any help. It just needed, okay, just keep adding in the characters. And one thing that we never had to do was worry about balancing, say, okay, well, Thor and Captain America have to be able to balance out. No, they don't. Yeah. They can be on the team with the Wasp and Tigra, and they're all four different power levels. Don't worry about it. They don't worry about it in the comics. Don't worry about it here. It's level and power balance and activity balance is something the DM would have to work with, but a lot of times the balance is already set for when you're in character creation, and the players and the game master can just determine, okay, what level are we working with, so everybody has a relatively same thing, so that way nobody overshadows the other players. But
Yeah, I mean, one of the concepts that you kind of mentioned there was what I call kind of role balancing, right?
mm-hmm,
I remember reading
mm-hmm,
that one of the concerns that went into designing, say, the Marvel Saga game behind me was that
mm-hmm,
Captain America had to matter, right? Because
mm-hmm,
he's an Avenger and he always has some role in the comic books. But there
mm-hmm,
are a couple of ways to have Cap matter. You can have him matter in the way that Champions does, right? Where
mm-hmm,
he has a certain skill level in martial arts or whatever that makes it so that he can potentially damage the Hulk equivalent opponent. Or you can do kind of what Marvel does, and that's that he's just got different skill sets, right? And he's got different capabilities. The shield still works the way that it's supposed to, and the Hulk's not going to be able to knock him out easily if he
mm-hmm,
gets defensive. But his role is different. And then you have that GM challenge of making the stories that you're presenting to the players, or the challenges you're presenting to the players, match the comic books too. And then Captain America matters. And
mm-hmm.
Cap can matter even when you have different power levels at the same time. And I think that's an interesting thing about superhero role-playing games that makes them a little bit different than D&D or other fantasy role-playing games, where I think sometimes players expect the characters not just to have role distinction, but also to have like attack parity with the other players in combat and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing that just popped into my head is if oh god, I'm blanked on who wrote it, but I think it was the climax of that nuke storyline in Daredevil, and you've got Daredevil monologuing all the way through, and he describes Cap as a voice that can command God speaks out, and it's like,
Right.
oh yeah, that's right there on the nose,
Right.
and you mean he's just helping one person, but he's the guy who asked Thor to put out, this blocks wide fire, and it's like that's how it works within the game and within the character. It's always better to worry less about exact balance numbers, which I think was it's it's one of the flaws or problems I had in running champions a lot of times is I love the system and I love the specificity of it, but the number crunching got in the way more than it helped for me as a player. But as a DM, it was great from okay, I know exactly what they can handle, what they can't handle, and you can play with that. It's just, I'm an English major. Don't make me do math that much.
No, and it's a game, Champions is a game that very much, I would say, though it is a very good role playing game, and certainly it has mechanical elements that foster and facilitate role playing in the sense that the modern gamer would understand that term. Like Critical Role could play it and incorporate many of the mechanics in a way that's meaningful.
Hmm.
But the combat system, right, the main core of that game is very much war game influenced, right? Straight down to
Hmm.
using the old school hex maps and having kind of really particular responses that you can do in combat mechanically that have a very gamey feel to them, or at least a very war gamey feel to them,
Hmm.
and they're pretty complex. Like you get some really complex interactions in the play, and then, as you said, when you're building the characters, well, that's math that requires a spreadsheet, to
Hmm.
really maximize it because they wanted everything to kind of be equal to one another,
Yeah,
right?
sorry.
That's all
Banged
right.
my computer out of alignment.
That's all right. Yeah, but I mean
Uh,
that's got a kind of wargamey feel, and in some ways it's Starfleet battles but with superheroes.
that's a great idea. No, I'd never really thought of it that way. But now I wish that I tried to play it more with people who were more wargaming savvy, so they could have taught me better. But so I'm just trying to think of any other anecdotes or older games that I remembered playing, and I gotta sneak a peek over here at the pile. Um,
Sure.
yeah, you know, that old classic. Yeah.
Oh, and that's my favorite edition too.
Oh
I mean
yeah, mine
that's
too. So yeah, this came out right. Oh, was just I think that was right before Gen Con in 1990, if I remember right. So yeah, that was wild stuff. That was good. And I've picked up a few of the successive editions, but yeah, I keep going back to that one as well.
I think they're all good, but I
Mm,
mean I wonder if Hero Games were to look at their sales, right? If their digital sales on that fourth edition are
mhm,
among their best. And I wonder for a variety of reasons because I think artistically they're, from a graphics perspective, also one of the best editions. The
oh
artwork
yeah,
in there. I mean, you got the George Perez cover on that book, right?
yeah,
So they
yeah.
they really hit a good stride there. What we have in the superhero genre, right? We've got Villains and Vigilantes, which I'll say, while it's math heavy, it's not math heavy in the same way that Champions is, and it's more like D&D focused, right? The stats are recognizable. If you're playing second edition, you're rolling
Mhm,
20-sided dice to hit people. So
mhm,
that feels kind of D&D-ish. Champions is very much a war game on a bell curve, with hex maps and spreadsheet characters. But
mhm,
then we've also got Marvel, very loose, and while it's got
mhm,
a table on the back, right, that's got the numbers you need to roll,
yeah,
it's more free form in the
mhm,
way that it represents combat and represents interactions with one another, and this is something I think is really interesting, right? Has, for its experience system, a thing called karma, which you can use to influence the game, but
mhm.
which you earn by essentially being Peter Parker with the broken ribs all the time. Right?
Yeah,
Spider-Man's ribs are always broken because Spider-Man needs his karma points.
yeah. It, it is. It's funny when I think of some of that stuff because why everybody always had to embrace Peter Parker's always got to be broke and be down on his luck. And you can send a few, sunbeams his way, but for the most part, he's going to be a sad sack. And it's like, Well, I understand Captain America. If he didn't have all of his government contacts and shield stuff and back pay from the army and so forth, he wouldn't be living a very good life trying to be a freelance illustrator in Manhattan. Come on,
Right.
or Queens or wherever it was he was. It's interesting when you look at how different writers in different generations have focused on what's the heart of the character.
Right.
And you and I are old enough that the Captain America I remember is probably the Roger Stern, John Byrne one.
Mm.
As
Mm.
short-lived as that was, it was very, very uh, essential for me. It was
Hmm.
just boiled down. This is a good understanding of the character, and so a lot of that stuff sticks in my memory when I'm thinking of the character. But some of the others, it's not nearly as easy to pin down and say, well, what makes this character tick? Okay, give me the how do you explain the Vision as a thumbnail?
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
sure. And
which
it would be
one?
harder. And that thinking about it mechanically, right, from a
Mhm.
Marvel superheroes perspective, right, as a DM or a GM, right, the karma system, right, it's experience points for behaving like the character
Mhm.
and doing the kinds of things the character would do in the comic books. So, like for Peter Parker, he would get karma for turning in photographs of Spider-Man fighting Venom to J. Jonah
Mhm.
Jameson on time, right? But for
And,
the Vision, like
and
that's a little more challenging, I think, to come up with what would be those core emotional beats outside of, say, the relationship with
mm,
Scarlet Witch, and that is in and out depending upon which era of the
mhm.
comic, right? And
Yeah.
I don't know if it would be particularly rewarding to have "Did you behave distantly and dismissively of the other players this session?" Um,
No, you must talk
you
in a
know,
monotone voice at all times.
right? And
But
there are eras when the character of the Vision that would very much be an accurate portrayal, but that may not be the best thing for the gaming table. But I
mhm.
like what Karma does to incentivize role playing, but in that
Oh yeah.
case, like maybe that would not be the role playing you would want to maximize.
Yeah, well, and some of them it is easier. I guess, the Vision is a bad example of, well, what do you need to do? And it's like, well, part of it is if you have to do a role playing thing, okay, have him meet some of the characters in a
Yeah.
place you wouldn't expect, but then make it work where, you happen to, go to a jazz club and, well, yeah, Simon Williams liked jazz, so that's partly in his brain pan sort of thing, but he was a poor example. It's not like, oh, make sure you pick up Aunt May's prescription. That'll get you
No, but I
karma.
think that I mean, you say it's a poor example, but in some ways that makes it a great example because it shows the challenge,
Mm,
right, of design of from a game perspective of rewarding, particularly when you want to reward role playing or reward capturing the narrative element of the thing being simulated, comic books,
hmm.
right? The Vision, depending on the era, right, throws in some challenges, just as the Punisher throws in some challenges too,
Oh yeah.
because he acts in a manner that, according to the comic book code authority, which existed at the time, and which is kind of reflected in the karma system of the game, would never earn any experience points, or almost never earn any experience
Yep.
points. He would be
Yep.
constantly
And
bottoming out.
and in some ways, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, no,
I
I
yeah,
agree. I
but
just
yeah,
imagine some players might get frustrated with
but
that.
I'd say one of the hidden features that the karma system always had was it was a backdoor explanation as to, well, why don't these characters increase in power levels and this and that? And it's like, because they are so busy burning their karma points to just do all the other things that aren't necessarily going to be in your power set and so forth and so on.
Yeah, I once ran, and I ran it for a couple of years, a DC Heroes game, another great superhero role-playing game, by the way, where and my personal favorite, but where I let the players build characters of different power levels, right, where they could max out at different levels, and one made like a couple made Thor equivalent characters, Hercules, that kind of thing, and
Yeah.
one made essentially a Spider-Man equivalent character, and the higher level characters or the more powerful level characters, they kept accumulating hero points. Like they earned them. Whereas the Spider-Man equivalent character, and I believe he was playing a version of Manhunter that was from the same planet as Coriander. That was the kind of gimmick that he was doing. So he had the ability to form energy around his fist instead of full energy projection, and he was more limited than Starfire. But he was at a power level distinctively lower, but he was one of the most active and contributory characters in combats, just like Spider-Man is, right? I always think I think it's Secret Wars when he fights the entire X-Men and wins
Yep.
for a moment, right? That
Yep.
he just would blow through every hero point he ever earned, and would be highly effective, and the player didn't mind not getting any better because he was effective, but he was spending a lot of hero points all the time, and Marvel does the same thing, that you can spend those karma points and things like that. And this gets to, I think, a question that you see a difference between, and I've got a couple boxes of Marvel behind me, right? Got the introductory box, and then above, right there, I've got the advanced box. And the advanced box is where I think Captain America is less playable, not in the basic set, he's already playable there, but in that original edition there, than he is once you add the advanced box, because of the way that they added to the skills and had martial arts work, which it doesn't make Captain America able to hurt people like the Hulk or the Thing, but it does let him be able to distract them while their equivalent comes in and actually does the real damage.
Oh yeah, and there's. I regret I've never actually sat down with Jeff Grubb and really picked his brain and got at the heart of how they came up with it, because he started building that system when he was in college, so it's something that he brought with him to TSR, and it's brilliant in its simplicity. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't have its problems. Every game system will have problems under certain conditions, but that's the only game system I've ever played where just with roll checking and whatnot, yes, you can punch your foe through 3 buildings. And it feels great to do that.
No, and it works in so many levels because it has a little bit of the wargaming element in the sense that it can simulate combat, it has initiative and things like that, but it also is very freeform and open and broad for narrative interpretation too. And I think that is a real strength of the design in that game. And I think is also the way that a lot of later superhero games have gone. Like, if you look at, say, the new-ish game Masks, right, where you play
I still
essentially
have to get a copy of that.
where you essentially play Teen Titans level characters, right? It's based on the Apocalypse World engine, so it's entirely narrative based. And of course, the first purely narrative based superhero game I remember is the Good Guys Finished Last,
Wow.
Villains Finished First books that come from that LA scene.
That was a flashback.
Yeah, I know. But the LA scene and the people at Better Games really just said, we want a game that's almost entirely narrative. And I think you see that more today And for the modern gamer, because I know there's a new Marvel coming out that's trying to bridge this balance,
Mm-hmm.
I think I think it's important to have that non-war game element to a large degree. Even if you do have, I mean, 5e, 5th edition D&D has a
Mm-hmm.
lot of war gaminess, but it
Yeah.
also has a lot of not war gaminess. And I think you need to have both to appeal to the larger and more modern group of gamers that exist today than in the 90s.
Mm-hmm. I have to admit, given the recent rise in the last couple of years of all those, you know, online video games, just people playing the game and being
Right.
recorded doing it. Um, I I will admit I haven't gone looking to see if there's that many Supers games being used and done, but I suspect that you will see at least a couple when the Marvel game gets released for Gen Con. Um, and it would be fascinating to see some of those professional actors that are doing stuff for Critical Role to,
Right.
sink their teeth into some superheroes, which would be a lot of fun. But
Yeah, I mean, the only one that I can think of, and I haven't gone looking, I only know this because it's a group that I support relatively frequently, is I know Saving Throw Show did a season of the Masks game where they
wow,
did the teen superheroes. But once again, those are like Critical Role, those are people who are trying to, in Critical Role, there are people who are paid actors. And then in the case of Saving Throw Show, some of them are, and some of them are aspiring actors. It depends.
mm-hmm.
People in all places in their career are part of that show, which is one of the reasons I
Yeah,
really like that. But they come at it from kind of the actor's perspective, which is why they played Masks instead of, say, a Champions game or something like
mm-hmm.
that. Though I honestly think that if you had the right setup and you had players who really knew the system, that you could play Champions that way too. Or
Oh,
and
sure.
certainly and certainly Marvel, the Marvel superheroes game, or as it's often referred to by older gamers, although I guess I pronounce it differently than everybody else. I call it FASERIP, but I guess a lot of people pronounce it FASERIP
No,
for
it's Face
the.
Whip.
Yeah, I've always pronounced it FASERIP, FASERIP,
Well,
but
yeah.
that system lends itself more than say Champions to an open-ended narrative style of play, and DC Heroes does too. But I think that for gaming, depending on what you want to focus on, either one of those approaches, like a strictly wargame approach or a one that's more tilted toward wargaming, is appropriate for comic books, and one that's more tilted toward story is also appropriate because it just depends on what part of the comic books you want to do, right? There
Mm-hmm.
there are issues like say where Wolverine fights the Hulk, right? Where or one of my favorite X-Men issues where Wolverine sits back as Juggernaut and Colossus go toe to toe for an entire issue that there's not a lot in that quote game session of 30 pages or whatever that is role playing, but there's a lot that would be fun to play out mechanically in a tactical way, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
superhero games definitely have room for both, and I'm just wondering which you think might appeal more to people playing today.
Ooh, I'd say honestly, it depends on the age of the players and the people involved. Because if you need to have concise rules to determine what is right versus what is wrong, what is the exact effect or whatever you're going for, um, a younger group of players is going to want that clarity and to
Mm-hmm.
know that yes, this is the right way to do this, and you won't be chastised for something because you did it wrong. No, you've got the rules right there. Um, people our age or such, we'd want a looser system, I think, because we aren't going to be nearly as worried about exactly the right roll and what the effect is going to be. I almost wish that more game systems had the that effects table like Marvel did, so you
Right.
don't necessarily you've got a little bit of narrative help in how much intensity is coming in from your critical hit there.
Right.
I mean, it's satisfying to say, oh, you do triple damage. It's like, no, it's trust me, it's much more cool when you knock that guy into next week,
Right.
almost
Well,
literally.
yeah, and I think there's something to have. A lot of the more narrative-based games like Apocalypse World and Masks, they have a system where essentially success or failure, whether you succeed or fail, determines not just whether you succeed or fail, but who gets to say what happened. Right. So
Okay.
it's more of a pass. It's more of kind of thinking of like the Baron Munchausen game, where in that one you bid money to compete for the storyline and drinks and things like that. But in this case, you're rolling a die or dice to
Mhm.
determine who has momentary control of the story, and it's a really effective way to play for some kinds of gamers,
Mhm.
right? But
Yeah.
for others, it can be either intimidating because they're not necessarily comfortable with that kind of, let's say they're not a drama major or an English major
Mhm.
and they're not comfortable with public
Yeah.
speaking. They like hanging out with their friends and playing, but they're quieter, right? So they'll get potentially outshadowed a little bit or overshadowed a little bit. Whereas if you have kind of distinct rules that where it's okay for one player to act everything out and be great,
Mhm.
but the other one can just say, I use my charisma to persuade him. And that mechanically that gets resolved without them needing to necessarily describe things is, I think that's a challenge. Certainly this isn't what this video is about, is GM advice in this
Mm.
case, although I'll be doing a series of videos called Dungeons and Dilemmas that is GM advice oriented, and I'll be bringing a bunch of people on for that. But it is a design challenge, and
Mhm.
from a game perspective, and for superhero games, there are both of those kinds of people, right? I mean, particularly post Marvel Revolution, which everybody I know was born post Marvel Revolution,
Oh,
where
yeah.
where they combined the Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four in those books are a fusion of Silver Age and Golden Age superhero stories with romance comic books, right? They are very soap operatic, and
Mhm.
that lends itself, one, to really good conflict in personal relationships, but also to a kind of play that's going to focus on that.
Mhm.
Which is why I think you might be right that we might see some group, whether it's Critical Role or someone else, come out with a really good, really fun channel that's got a superhero game going on, where they
Mhm.
put on where they do their cosplay and things like that.
Well, I'm going to bring up a topic it's one of the things that always seems to trip up supers games, just like it trips up the comic books.
Oh man, yeah. No, you
I'm
mentioned
using
that,
the
and I
DC
know.
Heroes Magic book, but I could have used the Marvel Magic game book with Doctor Strange on it because it's it always made me think of Jeff's Jeff Grubb's comment of, well, whenever there's a magic user involved in a game, you have to bring in your Doctor Strange rocks. Huh? It's like every episode of The Defenders. The first thing that happens is Doc Strange gets hit in the head with a rock or something to take him out of the fight to give Namor and the Hulk and something to do.
It is a really good point that you make about magic in superhero role playing games, and they've tried. And I know the first game you mentioned and you said it was the game that brought you in is villains and vigilantes, and I own both the first and second edition of that game. I own the more recent ones too, but when you're reading through the power section and you get to magic, it says, see chivalry and sorcery for ideas for spells.
It's either that or it says, you can duplicate every power in this book, but you use magic. It's like,
right, I mean, you use magic.
That both it tells me what I need to know, but it doesn't tell me what I need to know.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, DC, I think, tried to handle it in some ways the same way that Champions did, which is to give you the equivalent of a pool of points that you could do, but then you're literally just simulating whatever everybody else can do, right? And Magic characters, and I think Jeff Grubb was right when he said that, they really throw a wrench into the works, particularly into that thing we talked about at the beginning, which is that role specificity. What role does the wizard play? Whatever role he decides or she decides to play in this adventure.
Yeah, and it really, in a lot of ways, the role that your characters are playing, it's even more baked in than, say, in D&D. I mean, it's not just, okay, yes, we have the rogue, so we have someone to, check for traps, undo locks, and so forth. But, when you're dealing with the supers thing, I've never 100% bought into that theory. You have to have a flyer and a brick or tank or whatever you want to call them, and you have to have the thinker and the speedster. It's like, okay, if you really think you need to break it down that every team has to be like the Justice League of America, okay, that's your opinion. I am quite comfortable doing otherwise.
While there is role specificity or role, every player might need to find every player's character's role to make sure they're important. That in fantasy, they're more like meeples that you're moving in a worker placement game, that the rogues got their skill set, whereas in comic books that's not the case, because you can just end up with some really bizarre teams that don't have any kind of mix at all. If you look at some of the Spider-Verse things, Spider-Man's a pretty tough character, like completely underestimated in how strong he is all the time, right? He's essentially Hulk light, and you get a bunch of those in a team. Yeah, they're agile, but they're just like slightly less agile than the most agile character in the comics, about half the strength of the strongest character in the comics. So they're all hanging out together with the same skill set. Maybe little things. And certainly none of them have Peter Parker's disadvantage, which is, he's smart enough to invent an adhesive that's strong enough to hold the Hulk in place, but he's not smart enough to turn that into profit.
Though I can't remember who wrote it, but I loved, there was one scene that pops to mind where Spider-Man told the Hulk such a bad joke that it reverted him back to Banner. It was one of those, he had to stop being angry enough to be the Hulk because it was such a stupid joke. But that shows me a writer that is coming at it from the correct angle with Spider-Man, especially with the built-in limits of, you shouldn't be able to do X and Y and Z. I do remember when we were actively doing Marvel stuff at conventions, I would constantly get people asking, well, how can you have this character up against this? There's no possible way that they can do anything. It's like, that's what the red effects are for.
Right.
You say that something is impossible. Well, I can see where Spider-Man has taken on a Herald of Galactus and somehow won.
Right. You have to spend the karma. In the case of Marvel, right? That's what spending karma gets you, right? You spend to get the red effect, and yeah, that's going to mean that Craven the Hunter's going to come home and hunt for Aunt May, but it does mean and you're
Yeah.
going to have to.
In some ways, I'm almost wondering if a game would be, if it would help a game if you could work in some sort of mechanic to work in how much are you underestimating or overestimating somebody's impact? Because again, I'm just having random comics bouncing through my head when I'm thinking of
Yeah,
stuff like
sure.
this, and like early in the Excalibur series, where I think Juggernaut was breaking out of prison, and Captain Britain shows up to stop him. He you know, hits him as hard as he can, or so to speak. And, oh, that was cute. Are you done now? Just doesn't even phase him at all. Walks right past him. So
No,
it's
I
it
think
would be
that's an
something
important.
interesting to work in if you're constantly underestimating, or and that might work more on a helping you deal with, say, crowds of minions.
Hmm.
They're going to overestimate what you can do, and vice versa. Um, so giving you some sort of edge to wipe out 15 guys with one web swing across the warehouse or something like that. Um,
Right.
but
Yeah, and
again,
no, I think there are lots of different. That's the thing, right? Is with fantasy, you're depending on what your goal is, right? If you're trying to do what D&D did initially, and that's to emulate sword and sorcery fiction, you're going to look at the system a particular way. It's going to favor the fighters and the fighting men and rogues.
mm,
And then the magic users, if you're inspired by Jack Vance, which they were, going to be very limited or constrained
mm,
by that kind of rigid magic system. But if you want to do something like, let's say, Robert Jordan's fantasy series or Brandon Sanderson's, you know,
mm,
Stormlight Archive, then you're going to want a different magic system. But you can do that, and then you're just emulating one little thing. But the challenge that comic book games face is that
mm,
the rule of comics is whatever the writer thinks is cool.
yep.
And
And
there's
it's yeah, it's like that description of magical powers, and it's both freeing and utterly limiting in the same sense, because
right.
it doesn't give you enough to give you the answers. Okay, yes, this is how it needs to go. It's like, and depending on my mood, I can argue either side of that coin. I don't,
Mhm.
I don't have a preference either way, other than is everybody at the table having fun? Then you're doing it right.
Right.
That's all that matters.
Yeah, and I mean that goes to the thing that I alluded to earlier, which was drawing from Robin Law's kind of writings on
Hmm.
the kinds of different players that are out there. There are multiple kinds of people who play role playing games, and while Critical Role and other streaming shows are a particular kind of gamer, and they're certainly one that's growing and has been very healthy for the hobby in general. That's one kind of gamer, and you have
Yeah.
then you're going to also have the people who come from Hero Quest and want to take the next step and play role playing games after playing the best thing about Hero Quest is that it leads you to playing superhero role playing games.
Yeah.
That.
And and oh yeah, some of the a friend of mine has actually backed every single one of those come on Kickstarters for the Marvel. Oh nuts! I'm blanking on the title. Marvel
Oh, the
Challenge.
Zombicide one,
Hmm?
Marvel Zombicide, or the other Marvel game.
No, the other Marvel game with all the little miniatures and the circle of cards.
Yeah,
Unlimited,
United,
yeah.
Marvel United.
And
Yeah,
that's a brilliant game, but yeah, there's not much room for, role playing and whatnot in there. And the card system, while it's a brilliant mechanic, it doesn't it's Well, it keeps you limited in what you can and can't do. So you can't really pull in. If you've got a good knowledge of a character, you
Right.
don't have the freedom to do with it what you will. So, yeah.
But it might inspire, right? See, it might inspire you to play a superhero role playing game. Then you've got these really cool cartoony miniatures, right? That you
Hmm.
could play with,
Oh, yeah.
and go forward with. And if you backed the most recent version of that, then you've got a Galactus that you can use. Although that hasn't come out, they haven't shipped it to me yet. I
Yeah,
backed it
yeah,
too.
that
They haven't
that
shipped it
was too
yet, but
rich for my blood, but I have to admit I'm going to remember my friend since he had all of these things. He's like, "Okay, what's the goofiest thing you can think of?" It's like, "I'll play Squirrel Girl, you play
right,
Howard the Duck,"
yeah, and
and who I think we ended up defeating Modoc or something like that. And
yeah, and I
it's
just
it's silly fun, and but that's exactly what you wanted out of that at that moment. It was, I mean, I've run so many Marvel games at conventions. I dearly miss doing that because I used to go every year down to the Chicago Comic Con and July 4th weekend and take all those loose leaf character sheets of every character we'd statted up for Marvel. And I would just, let a group of people come to the booth and, okay, who do you want to play? And let everybody pick their characters.
right.
And then from that, I just, you know, give myself 20 seconds to think of a villain or a group of villains to throw at them. And it'd just be nothing more than we're going to freewheel a quick combat and, have a lot of fun with it. And so often it was more fun when, when you have one group of kids that's very used to each other and they know how they're going to play. We're going to play the X-Men and we can beat anybody you throw at us. And so I wipe the floor with them with Hydro Man or whatever. It's those little things, and I miss both the freedom to just wing it with the characters when everybody knows what you can expect with them. I think that's the best thing with the licensed supers games is everybody is going to come into those with an understanding of a lot more of the characters and a lot more of the world. So even if you say, you know, you could have a lot of fun doing a all magic powered game in the Marvel system because you've got some understanding of that universe
Right.
and you're playing that particular version because you want to go traipsing in those weird Ditko-esque, landscapes.
Right.
But that when you get into the you're building everything systems, it gets trickier because it's not an even playing field for all the people involved. Because if the DM is making up a lot of stuff, it's hard to know what can be considered fair, balanced, whatever. I mean,
Right.
it's uh, it's tricky. It's a balancing act. So it
So
always comes down
I'll
to
finish out with this question,
what's that?
I'll finish out with this question and comment
Okay.
that our friend Matt Forbeck is hard at work on the new Marvel
Hmm.
Superheroes game. Comes out this August. I'm super excited about it. I've already
Hmm.
pre-ordered it and the expansions that are coming out, both at my local gaming store and online. I want it as soon as I can get it. But I noticed one thing that kind of amazed me was early during the playtest process, a lot of fans of the older Marvel Superheroes system, the TSR one you worked on,
Hmm.
came out of the woodwork and they helped shape the way that Matt's game is going, and they were really an active and vibrant part of that playtest in the first place. I was surprised how many of them there were because it's a quote dead game, right? But
Yeah.
what do you think contributes to its longevity?
Um. The I think it just comes back to the familiarity with the world and the characters. It's a comfort zone in some ways. I mean, you know what you can expect, and plus, yeah, even if it isn't being actively published, that stuff doesn't vanish off the shelves. I mean, and now with the internet, I can find nearly everything I would ever want or need online, for good or ill.
Right.
I don't own any of it, so I'm not going to kick it. But and actually, last year, a great group of people that are still supporting the FASERIP stuff. You know, they took some old articles I did with Polyhedron way back when that I had forgotten about, and they put them together with a brilliant cover with a bunch of inset art, and there's a Doctor Doom adventure out there that I had totally forgotten about in the intervening 30 years.
Yeah,
And
and I think that
but
yeah,
yeah, the
I think fan
longevity just
communities are
comes
really
in.
important. Yeah.
In it's an easy system, and if you know, it's you're almost always going to gravitate back to the first system that you fell in love with as a gamer, whether it's D&D or Car Wars or GURPS or whatever it might be. But and for some people, yeah, the Marvel system was uh, foundational. Um,
Yeah,
and
I'm for sure going to try and run auto duel superheroes for my kids at some point because they did for Car Wars do a superhero supplement. So I'm very much going to try that.
I want to read that review or somehow play in that.
Yeah, no, we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, I don't,
So I'm curious to see what they're going to do with the new Marvel game, but I will think they're hard pressed to come up with a few better titles than they managed in the years that was being published.
the TSR Marvel Superheroes game is a great game. Definitely worth tracking down. And you know, I'm a big fan of the Marvel Superheroes Adventure game too, the Saga edition. I
Yeah.
think that the card play is in that is unique and really I think every version of a Marvel superheroes game that came out, the Margaret Weiss one, I think was also very good. But each has been different, and I do think that, as you mentioned, there is something. Maybe it's because it was the first one I played that draws me back to the original TSR one. But I also think it's the way that it balanced the wargaminess with the narrativeness that really was central to Jeff Grubb's design. Just allowed for it to capture the comic book feel the way that I wanted to. Well, hey, we've been chatting for a while. Thank you very much for visiting. And hopefully you'll be back and we can chat some more about other games and things like that. But we'll
Okay.
talk superheroes again.
Shall we play a game?
This geek of technology.
He's a Highlander, by God.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play.